by Kaylee's husband. I have the honor of introducing Pancake up here before the keynote. A couple things about me. I teach over at Nelsonville High School. One of the electives I teach is Appalachian literature. So in that, we learn about the history of our area, but also kind of examine the representation of our area. And we do that through honoring the voices of great authors like Pancake through reading her excerpts and short stories. So it's a blessing to have her voice and her story in our class to teach the kids in Nelsonville just about our culture, our history, and just the tradition of what it means to be Appalachian. So I'm going to share with you the bio for Anne real quick, and then I'll let the keynote take it away. But Anne Pancake is a native of West Virginia. She's published 2 award-winning short story collections and a novel, Strange as This Weather Has Been, which was one of Kirkus Review's top 10 fiction books of the year and won the Weatherford Prize for the best book in Appalachia. Her stories, essays, and scholarships have appeared in venues like Orion, the Georgia Review, Poets and Writers, and the Journal of Appalachian Studies. She taught creative writing at several universities before becoming a freelance writer. She lives in Preston County, West Virginia.
Thank you for the introduction. I want to apologize so much for not being there. It was quite a shock when I woke up with COVID yesterday morning. But I want to thank everyone, especially Kaylee, for her flexibility and her making it possible for me to still be there in this way without infecting everybody. So welcome and thank you everybody for coming. I hope you had a great day yesterday. I sure wish I could have been there. And so I know that Kaylee, we have someone to read part of it, right? To read the keynote. Is that you?
Hi.
Okay. Well, Brianna, I think what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is go ahead and start myself and read several pages before I start losing my voice or coughing, and then I'll hand it over to you, and then at the end I'll be happy if we have time to take questions and stuff. So, and Brianna, thank you so much for doing this. So I think that you guys in the audience should have some handouts. Okay. So the way that I'm going to start the talk is I'm going to read one of the poems that's in the handouts, and it's a Steve Scafidi poem, The Hillbilly Breakdance and the Talking Crow. So if you want to pull that up, I'm going to read that, and y'all can read along. So this is Steve Scafidi, Hillbilly Breakdance and the Talking Crow. Steve is a West Virginia poet, and he's from over towards Ohio. I think he's on this side of the Ohio River. So the school bus skids around the mountain and kills my friend's dog almost instantly, and Lester in the back seat sticks his face out the window to say, "Don't eat that dog, he's dead meat," and laughs, and that was long ago. And Lester lives in the mountain ghetto where the rich have not yet ruined the land with their paper mansions, and he is hillbilly wild as a teenager and learns to break dance and locks and pops and turns and rocks like a robot on summer nights, drunk under the Christmas lights of his back porch, where we watch as Lester works through his routine, and once he moonwalked right off the edge and dropped down hard into the honeysuckle and the blue rocks of the place and sprung back to his feet and said, "I'm all right, goddammit," and shinning back up to move some more, and so it is not hard to believe. Lester banged out of his house last week, bored on a Sunday afternoon in August, and wandered in the woods of the mountain as if through some cathedral so dark with leaves and fiddlehead ferns that light only reaches the ground through 1,000 little tunnels. And suddenly, at his feet, hopping along, comes a crow who says, "All right then, all right. Hey, how are you?" And Lester stops. "All right then, how are you?" says the crow again, and cocks its head and looks up with his beady eye at Lester, who looks away. Trucks rumble down the mountain hard in the distance, and an airplane starts to make a sharp curve a mile above, but they don't know any more about the world for a minute. Lester and the crow talking a while, he says, just shooting the breeze. He says that crow knew the names of his father and his grandfather and all kinds of personal shit. And it said, Lester, look at you. You've grown middle-aged and fat, but I like you anyways. And flew back into the trees just to let him think about it. And 6 other people have talked to this crow, and now it is legend. And that is why I am sitting in the Mount Hebron Cemetery with a picnic lunch and waiting while the story does its thing, I guess. Flying from tree to tree, chasing owls, maybe looking for something shiny. Which is why I have lined up 10 dimes and a safety pin on the stone wall. To attract some magic. To call down the blessing of an impossible thing. All right then, it is getting darker. Let the new life begin. So Kaylee asked me to talk about how one can tell authentic Appalachian stories. And I think Hillbilly Breakdance and the Talking Crow is a quintessential authentic Appalachian story, or actually stories, and that the story is really stories, multiple stories, wrapped up in one story, crow, magic, dog, breakdancing. Maybe that's another authentic Appalachian story characteristic. It reminds me of something I hear myself saying to my partner, and she always laughs, even though I don't mean it to be funny. Remind me to tell you a story after I finish this one. If you grew up in Appalachia or live here, I mean really live here, not just live on top of here, you've probably been immersed, whether you are conscious of it or not, in experiences that make Appalachians some of the country's, heck, the world's finest storytellers. Our history, our culture, and our place are rich with qualities that alchemize into unique and extraordinary storytelling art. And what qualities am I talking about? Oral storytelling is still alive in Appalachia in ways it is not in many other places. I've lived in a lot of other places and I learned. You grow up in small town in rural Appalachia like I did, you hear endless stories. You hear them all the time. Hunting stories and wreck stories and flood stories and dog stories. Notice Steve Scaffidi's poem hits the wreck genre and the dog genre and puts a twist on the hunting genre. I heard stories about rats running up your pants and biting your privates, and about snakes who stole cow's milk, and people who burned heavy metal records and Satan threw them back out of the fire. And that doesn't count all the stories that are commonly called just gossip, but that feed a storyteller anyway. I mean, just last month, in the courthouse paying my taxes, I heard a man tell about a Jack Russell Terrier so hyper it could run horizontally around room walls. And a day or two after that, the nurse at the clinic I go to told me how in their old building, which was a double wide, which was a funeral home before it was a clinic, in that ex-funeral home clinic, they would hear a grandfather clock apparition chiming the hours. And I know a lot of you too could retell right now a good story you've heard just within the last couple weeks. There's also the innovation in the music in our language. As a kid, I heard inventive and metaphoric and beautiful language, brilliant turns of phrase. I had a first grade teacher I adored who threatened us when we were bad that she'd skin us alive. A father who made up names for things if he didn't know what they were. He'd say, I call that a goggle eye, or look, there's a land crab. I listened to other kids talk about squirrel warbles and snake doctors and hoop snakes. Now those are examples of the original and the weird and the wild, but you also want to bear in mind the beauty too, how the weird and wild can also be beautiful. And how it's not just words that are beautiful, it's the cadence, the melody of our language, the accent too. Listen to Hillbilly Breakdance again. The bottom of the first page. Along comes a crow who says, all right then, all right, how are you? And Lester stops. All right then, how are you? Says the crow again and cocks its head and looks up with its beady eye at Lester, who looks away. And I also want to introduce you to West Virginia writer Jessie Van Eerden when we're talking about the beauty of our language here, if you don't already know her work. And I have in the handout that I gave you all a passage from her novel Call It Horses, if you want to bring that up. And I need to set this up a little bit to give you some insight into the tension in the passage. The narrator here is married to the character Clay, who you'll see in the passage, but who she wants, who she desires, is the character Stu, who's in here. So I'm starting to get short on my throat, so I'm gonna ask Brianna to go ahead and pick up reading for me on this passage. And Brianna, you can read a little shorter than what I'll put it, just if you do a couple paragraphs. But as she reads, please listen to the cadence and the music of this, and her subtle use of dialect in both syntax and in diction. Thank you, Brianna.
I knew and understood myself in work. I could still smell the pungent squash vine from the morning hour. I was eager to handle bark and brush, and in that eagerness, the air grew familiar and good in the cab. We didn't need to agree on rolling down the windows, despite the chill. We let the September wind wrap us, and the core pole in me that carried the surge up and down to chest and neck heated like a coil, like the engine as Clay shifted into fourth, headed east on Hollow Road, toward the edge of Rex and Miranda's farm, where the good locust trees had fallen in a storm, the hard wood that burned almost as hot as coal, Clay said. Heat gathered in Clay's hand upon my leg. Stu watched the world pass. I felt stripped down to that radiating coil once we pulled in the tram road cockeyed and parked and spilled out to start the work. I left the gloves I had refused balled up on the vinyl seat, tied back my thick hair, shed the flannels, pushed up the sleeves of the long underwear shirt to carry the firewood bare-armed. I worked with speed and hum, each bending of my body alert to the scent of the saw's two-cycle oil, the burn and the sawdust, the men's awareness of me. Stu acquiesced to smoke silently with me as Clay cut, and when the saw shut off, we all picked up and attacked the full cord in the bed. If the pieces were small, I took them in twos, and the knocking together of the locusts sounded musical, like thick wind chimes, a deep tone in all that dense grain. My biceps tensed. I knew they watched. My forearms went taut. Dust gathered in the arm hair, and the surge centered and swelled in my abdomen, pelvis, upper thighs. A capacity opened up. My groin heated as I squatted in the dust for another piece. We worked until the evening dew started to fall, and we could feel it on our faces. I tasted cigarettes and the salted roasted seed bits working free from in between my teeth. When it was time, I said I'd drive. Clay took the middle, and I drove too fast given the weight in the pickup's bed, but Clay said nothing. At the house, I lumbered to the truck a little off the road since Stu's red pickup barred the way to the woodshed. He offered to move it and then help unload and stack.
Thank you so much, Brianna. If you want to keep reading, I would appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to continue with Anne's word for her keynote. If you're Appalachian, you've likely spent time around unique people, often storytellers themselves, unique people of many sorts, not just one sort, which is important to remember for what I'll say later about characters and caricatures. When I was little in Summersville, West Virginia, for example, we had next door to us an older lady we called Aunt Ruthie, who lived in a magical house with a revolving wall bookcase, an upstairs studio where she painted pictures, a monkey carved from a poisonous nut from some faraway place, and lots of bridge mix and fresca. Then I could walk with my dad about half a mile from Aunt Ruthie's to visit Mr. Nutter, an untalking man who lived an 1800s lifestyle. No car, so you'd see him walking through the neighborhood to the grocery store with a big gunny sack on his back. He lived in an unpainted two-story house where he raised a giant garden and pigs in a spooky little shed. We know that if you grow up in rural Appalachia, you probably didn't grow up with the racial diversity you might in a city. But it's important to remember that we grew up with some other diversity many white suburban and urban people didn't. We grew up among people from different socioeconomic classes, and that's less likely for middle class and wealthy people in suburbs and cities where neighborhoods are usually segregated by class. We also may have known more disabled people than your average suburban American knew, and we probably spent time around people older than us, a kind of generational diversity that can be rare in dominant American culture. These experiences with different people can make you humble and grateful, can foster empathy, can make you fight harder against social injustice. And all those things, in turn, contribute to good storytelling. Of course, another quality that makes us storytellers is our famous sense of place, our connection to the land in Appalachia. When I moved back to West Virginia 7 years ago, I wondered if the young people here still had that attachment to place. I kind of suspected they didn't. But I learned from my students real quick that their rootedness in this place, for better or for worse, was as real as it was for me when I was their age. If you're Appalachian, you might have grown up spending all kinds of time in the woods and in the creeks, dreaming up crazy games there with your brothers and sisters and cousins and friends, following around parents or grandparents who taught you names of things outside and laid into you not to ever give up the land. Maybe you grew up like me, loving a river that gave me ear infections and boils, drinking iron water and eating deer and squirrel, which takes us back to those warbles I mentioned. It's important to remember that we understand place isn't just setting, it's relationship, it's culture. And the land itself, places in it, call up all kinds of stories. Maybe it also carries voices, maybe even songs. On top of all those storytelling riches, there's also our sense of humor, our quirkiness. There's our fraught emotions about this place, the deep attachment to here, and the just as deep yearning to leave here, or even better, for a here that is more just, less exploited, less poor. It's our perpetual underdogness. It's our being told all our lives we're not as good as other people, which makes us want to prove we are. And it's how, when you're little, you probably don't have access to visual art, theater, dance, but you could always get a hold of a pencil and paper. And you could always corner your younger cousins and brothers and sisters in the basement or the barn or the porch or a hideout and make them listen to your stories. And if, like I did, you spent hours and hours bored in church, you might have had a whole lot of practice telling stories in your head. Here we are with all these riches. So how do we do them justice, do Appalachia justice in our own storytelling? How do we tell our stories instead of the stories told about us that unfortunately we've been swallowing all our lives? How do we tell our stories and not the stories that dominant culture, especially commercial culture, wants to reward us for telling what may be only shadows of our real stories? Maybe shallow, easily digestible counterfeits, or perverse fabulations, or cute, folksy, Cracker Barrel renditions of what and who we really are. I've been writing about this place for over 40 years and have had to starve off those shadow stories myself, and I've learned some things about how to push past them to stories more real. First, look close and deep and see what's here, not what you've been taught is here by all those other stories. And I mean look close and deep at both the people you tell about and at the narratives you use. Stereotype and caricature usually have a kernel of truth, but when you resort to them, you're not getting past the paint. Think depth perception. Be patient, sink in, inhabit, and feel empathy for those inside your story as you create that story and tell that story. Treat place the same way, not just as background. And be cautious that you are not carrying your characters in place in a thin, overtold narrative. I want now to read you a story, a letter poem, that hollers back to a recent story most Americans fell for, hook, line, and sinker, even when we shouted at the top of our lungs that it was fake. It's by poet Torley Bush from his book For a Redbird. And as you listen, notice how it's about injustice, but it also has those other qualities I mentioned, like place, deep people, and glorious language. The name of this poem is J.D. So this is in the packet as well, and you'll see it starts with J.D. It's a letter poem. And before I read today, I looked up this author, and you can actually hear him read this on Instagram and TikTok, so we'll try to share that on our social media because his reading of it is very powerful. JD, in some ways our stories are alike. I was also raised by my white grandparents in Webster Springs, West Virginia, from the time I was 7 years old. I'm black. Before your mind trails off too far, Dad's white, Mom's black. She died in the after of childbirth, brain aneurysm, from having sickle cell anemia. Dad was in the Navy at the time. Going with his parents was eventually the best option. I had a good life, I can admit that. I had some kind of anomalous privilege of growing up well off because James Lee Bush Sr., my grandfather, worked and retired from coal mining. I wanted to believe that your book wasn't that bad, that it was a feel-good story that got misconstrued. I'm sorry no editor checked your ego at the door. If you would have stuck to the memoir, the worst would have been you outing your grandmother as crazy enough to cap a man with a six-shooter. Even that would have been too much, because anybody who's Appalachian knows you don't paint your grandmother like that, JD. Like hillbilly was the only word that could define her. Like she wasn't a homemaker, like my grandmother, keeping you fed and clothed and getting the sense of needing an education into you. You couldn't even bring yourself to admit what good you had, how it advantaged you. Even being black and out of place, I can see what I had. I saw my classmates too. Here's some people I graduated with. Tyler Neal didn't come from much, but started his own timbering business and has a family doing well for himself. Cassandra Clevenger lost her mom as a young woman. She's a pharmacist now. Ariel Lake had her house burned down our senior year. She pushed and did her undergrad in 3 years and became a physical therapist. Cameron Clutter became a barber and can play a mean electric guitar. Samuel Canfield, a biologist, trying to help the changing environment. There's so many others in my class who went into a trade or healthcare or just outright working. We ain't fucking lazy. I was the only black kid in my grade for most of my time up until high school, but I know that I ain't the only black person in the whole of Appalachia. Where were people like me in that white model that you wrote, JD? Tucked behind your ranting and raving on welfare queens? You just gotta pretend like we don't exist, like we're all just rust-butt ghosts and magnolia tree ornaments? You ain't been to the core of Appalachia where the wild magic is. The hollers know every skin tone. It's kind of Christian, kind of queer, kind of folk, kind of soul food and moonshine. It's perfect dirt, fishing, hunting, and playing basketball into the nighttime till we bond around bonfires. There's an empty wicker chair and a mason jar with your name on it. Come find me. Learn who we really are. It was the first time that I had heard that today, and like I said, watching him read it himself is really powerful. So we'll see if we can post that to our social media in case you'd like to see that. Another thing I'd like to say about telling a true Appalachian story is listen. There's plenty out there that works to stand down, regularize, homogenize our language. But listen, we have a mother logic language. Hone your ear. Appalachian English is rich in metaphor, in diction, in ingenuity, and inventiveness. As I said earlier, there is music in our cadences, syntax, and inflections. Hear what's really here, not what outside popular culture has said is here. And resist the shaming that insists we talk like we're from no place at all. What I've also learned through 40 years of writing stories is that to tell a real story, you have to honor the story and the art of telling it over yourself and what yourself might want. The story has its own life, its own soul, its own power. Your job as teller is to serve the story. So to tell an authentic Appalachian story, take your time in the making of it and the presentation of it. Put that Appalachian work ethic into practice. Don't rush because you want to publish more or reach an audience quicker or get reactions right away or fast track your career. In a culture that screams for quantity, choosing quality is an act of resistance. A last thing I'll say about telling any story is trust your unconscious mind when you're making it. Storytelling, both in the creating of it and the receiving of it, opens that door between our conscious and our subconscious. Everyday American culture is pretty committed to keeping that door shut, but making art is a practice that still lets us come and go. To be cut off from our unconsciousness steals part of our humanity. And in that unconscious, in intuition, in dreams, dwell ideas, solutions, utterly fresh ways ways of perceiving and understanding that we need urgently in the era of disillusion and transformation we're living in right now. And speaking of that era we're in, I've been thinking a lot, and maybe you have too, about the imperative of authentic and truthful storytelling under an authoritarian regime that has built itself and sustains its rule almost entirely on false stories. How critical authentic storytelling is to counter a dominant industry, the tech industry, that uses half-truths and untruths to capture, inflame, and divide societies so its overlords can get richer. And in the face of all this, how powerful it is to tell truthful stories, to preserve true and good things through stories, to bear factual witness in our stories. And some of you might say, what do you mean? The stories that I tell, that you tell, are fictional stories. In response, I ask you to ponder that adage, fiction is the lie that tells the truth. I'd alter it to, fiction can be a lie that tells a bigger truth. It's up to us tellers if we want to tell that bigger truth. How do real stories resist the false stories in this era? Real stories can expose darkness and wrongdoing, celebrate overcomings and joys, teach truths about both historical and present injustices. I have a story for you now, a song story that does all these things. It's called Lazarus, and it was written by Mary Linscheid and Travis Steinling, and performed here by Mary Linscheid's band, The Wild Sharks. The lyrics are on your handout if you'd like to look at the lyrics as we listen.
From
stories do in times like these. They generate empathy. Sometimes it's difficult to feel with our hearts, our guts, the overwhelming cruelties rampant now. And likewise, it can be difficult to feel sustained compassion for those nameless souls struggling with so many different catastrophes. But we do have great capacity to empathize with the personal stories of individuals. I once heard Wendell Berry point out that public suffering means nothing if it isn't understood as compounded of an almost infinite private suffering. He went on to illustrate this with a quote from Andre Gide's World War II journals. After wandering through the battle-ravaged Tunis, Guide wrote, "Thousands of sufferings make a plateau. It's like that bed of nails you can lie down on. But one death, one instance of suffering, one Lear, one Hamlet, is the point of sorrow." Stories do exactly that. They immerse the reader in the personal stories of individual people. They dissolve that bed of nails built by information overload. Stories are one of the few arenas where you can live the life of a person different from yourself. And by living that life, you can come to feel empathy and compassion we desperately need to restore. Empathy brings us to how storytelling creates community and human connection, as it has since we human beings first started using language. By deeply listening to the stories of others and offering ours for them to hear, we see how we are alike, where we connect, and where we differ, and in a space where we can learn to respect those differences. A number of years ago, people from the Letcher County, Kentucky Committee Hub came to West Virginia University and introduced us to story circles. The methodology was developed by Roadside Theater, the theater wing of Appalachia and Junebug Productions. With story circles, you bring people together, including strangers and people who may be very different from one another. You sit in a quiet circle, set some basic guidelines, and then offer a prompt. Tell a personal story about... Sit in silence until someone is moved to tell a story. After that first story is told, move to the next person on the left. Each person, as you go around the circle, tells a personal story that responds to the earlier stories told. You stay with the telling of your story without interpreting it or explaining it or using it to argue an agenda. As you go, everyone learns about each other without judgment. People see the similarities between each other, and you are quietly building a central collective story. Before I finish, I need to say this too. Never underestimate the power of the beauty in our stories. Beauty elevates us and demonstrates how darknesses might be transcended. Beauty inspires hope. Consider the beauty in all these stories you've heard in the last half hour. Steve Stafidi, Jesse Van Eerden, Mary Linscheid and the Wild Shoats, Torley Bush, all very different beauties from each other, and also fresh beauties, and how they open and lift your heart in your listening of them. Beauty in art can be political too, can make an audience question the status quo, can shake up stagnant thinking and jolt us into original perspectives and ideas. Beauty can also simply help heal. As Phil Ox put it several decades ago, in such ugly times, the only true protest is beauty. Finally, through stories, we can imagine into existence future worlds we want for ourselves and those we love. We envision ways of living that refuse savagery, celebrate what is right and good, and honor the lives of all humans and all other creatures too. We offer meaning in a world that to many seems more and more meaningless. We are able, as Scafidi says at the end of his poem, and you can look back to it, that's that first one that we read, the Hillbilly Breakdance and the Talking Crow, to attract some magic, to call down the blessing of an impossible thing. All right then, it's getting darker. Let the new life begin.